every country is going to have to come up with their own solution. Every country basically has three paths to choose from. Number one, you kind of glom on to a country where this isn't a big deal. So in the case of Mexico, you obviously partner with the United States. The Japanese, for example, have decided that that's the way to go, and they cut a deal with both Donald Trump and Joe Biden. The Japanese are the only country to pull that off so far, and they are now part of the inner circle of the American strategic network. Second, you can find a way to go it alone. Maybe you don't need the allies. Maybe what you need is close and you can do kind of a neo-imperial system. I can see the French doing this. I can see the Turks doing this. Option three is you just figure out how to go without.
Okay, Peter, so why do you pick, it's a bit like that part of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, why do you pick sort of 1980 to 2015 as this golden era that's now gone forever?
Well, by the time we got past 1983 and the last real nuclear scare with the Soviets, relationships were steadily warming until the Cold War ended, in which case Russia was at least temporarily invited into the family of nations. So the structure of globalization was able to spread to the entire population of the world. At the same time, we were in this hanging moment demographically, where we knew that birth rates had been dropping for decades, and that meant in a lot of the advanced world we were rapidly running out of children. But we still had all kinds of adults that had not yet aged into retirement. So we had this massive block of workers and consumers that were driving every part of the economy that we would ever want to be driven. It wasn't sustainable because there were no children. But for about 35 years, we were in this glorious moment where all things were possible, where there's plenty of finance, where there were no security risks, and where anyone who wanted to play a part in the international trading system could, and it was backed up by just these massive waves of workers and consumers. It was perfect. It was temporary.
That's so interesting, that's almost a sort of end of history moment, isn't it? The idea that we've kind of cracked it, we've kind of cracked liberal democracy, we've kind of cracked capitalism, late capitalism, which has a bit of a conscience about it, and therefore everything in the garden is rosy, except it isn't.
Yeah, it was fun while it lasted.
So what has fundamentally changed? I mean, one definition of globalization is that money is taken from the poorest people in rich countries and given to the richest people in poor countries.
The truth isn't quite that simplistic. I mean, I understand the position. The moving around and the spreading around is certainly the issue. So globalization encouraged every country who wanted to play, even if these were countries that could never have been economically successful on their own in a pre-globalized system. So as a rule, and again, oversimplification, if the British Empire thought you were worth conquering, you probably couldn't make a go of it on your own. And so you had all these countries that had been colonies that all of a sudden under the American-led globalization model could play and didn't have to worry about their security. And in that sort of environment, the countries with good geographies, your United States, your France's, your Britain's, faced competition from a quarter that they never had before. And since they didn't have to worry about security costs, all of a sudden they were the low-cost producer for a lot of manufactured goods. And so we saw an industrial hollowing out of the advanced economies writ large, going to some of the secondary ones that have had a really hard time of it before. I might add this includes Germany. In that sort of environment, whether or not the wealth was distributed was a political decision to be made by the countries on the receiving end of that. So in the case of Korea or Germany, we got relatively egalitarian societies. In the case of Indonesia and India, not so much. And so I'm cautioning you against conflating the overall globalized trends and then decisions that were made at the local level. There are interrelationships, but it's definitely not caution.
I see that. What about China in all of this then? Because China is now the giant elephant in the room of all of this, which becomes the factory for the whole world. It develops a middle class to a certain extent of its own, but what you're saying is it doesn't lead to any balancing in this world of globalization.
Well, let's look back at the Chinese history for a second. Here the Han ethnicity has been around for 3,500 years. But despite all that history, the Han Chinese have only been in charge of the bulk of the Chinese population for about 300 years. This is a place with a horrible geography, incredibly water poor in some parts, very rugged in others. And that means they've never been able to pull it together themselves. All of the Chinese empires of old, very few of them lasted more. At their peak, when we see all those maps in our books, in many cases, those maps only lasted for a few years, sometimes only for a few weeks before it all went to hell. And that's before you consider rampaging outsiders coming and wrecking the whole thing. So you only have about 300 years of unified Chinese history. Half of that is under the Mongols. Half of the rest is since 1945, when the Americans sent the Europeans and the Japanese home. So this myth that China has always been the biggest component of humanity is just that, a myth. And it was only with the globalized system in 1945 that the Chinese finally didn't face an external oppressor and could get around to the busy work of consolidating their own country under Mao. Fast forward to the Nixon-Mao summit of the 70s, and in order to turn the Chinese against the Russians, the Chinese were invited into the globalized order by the Americans. And that created the China that we know, a China with no security threats, a China with access to a world full of raw materials and markets. So this is an artificial construct carried out under an artificial environment in the most atypical period in human history. So of course they did well, but you break any part of that. You remove the Americans from the equation and globalization breaks. You look at their demographics and play it forward and you see that they don't have a workforce, and this goes away. So China, just like the world at large, has enjoyed the best 35 years of its history, and it's over.
And so your book posits what happens next. At one level, you could read this as a utopia, couldn't you? People actually producing goods for themselves. The world shrinks once more. The world expands once more. It's got too easy for people to be connected, and actually countries could become more independent again. But that's not really what you're saying, is it?
Right. I mean, think of it this way. Let's say it was just you. How long would it take you to make a smartphone? It's like the idea of producing goods for yourself sounds great until you want something that is more advanced than yarn. Specialization is what brings us the modern world. It's what's allowing this call right now, linking two continents together in real time. Something as simple as, I just bought myself some new earbuds. There's 1,200 supply chain steps to this. The idea that any one country could pull that off is asinine. And that's before you start considering the fact that we now have over half of the human population dependent directly on food imports, and about 3/4 of the world's population dependent upon fertilizer imports so that they can grow their own food. The degree of interconnectivity that we have is extreme. And if you break down the trade links that make all of that possible, we don't get to do this with 8 billion people, and we do not get to do this with our current standard of living.
So is this a sort of Malthusian moment, in your view, where ultimately we can't sustain the populations that we have?
I don't know if I'd quite use that word, because that assumes the steady state system, and it's the system itself that is cracking apart. When we go into a more regional or even national economic model, the global whole that we've become used to these last 45 years, that is what breaks up. That is what is in danger. And there are parts of the world that were not able to expand their populations until they could import food, thinking primarily about the Middle East here. And there are portions of the world that were not able to get into manufacturers trade until the security environment changed, thinking primarily East Asia with this. And then there are parts of the world that have had to go to war for energy in the past but haven't recently. Now I'm thinking about Europe. If we remove those inputs that come from a different continent, we've got to find a way to do it either closer to home, or we have to venture out to get it ourselves. Now, in the case of my country, we're the world's largest producer of energy, world's largest producer of food. We're the second largest manufacturing power. You throw in Mexico and Canada, and we're very close to Canada, or to the Chinese already. This is a bumps in the road sort of scenario. Now, we're American. We're going to panic about the bumps in the road. That's just how we are. But if you look at other portions of the world, the degree of dislocation that is now being forced upon them is becoming very real, very fast. To use an example in your backyard, we had the Nord Stream pipeline shut down last week. That is the number one transit point for getting Russian natural gas into Germany. The German economy isn't like the British or the American economy. We're a little bit more lackadaisical about our supply chains, and that allows us to diversify. The Germans keep it all in-house. So yes, some of that natural gas is used for electricity, but most goes into chemicals and petrochem. That forms the basis of German heavy industry. Those inputs are not exported. Those inputs are then used in medium and light industry in Germany. So they just lost the base material that allows modern Germany to exist. And we're going to find out this year how well that's going to go. And it doesn't look great, because even if the Germans can get natural gas from somewhere else, it's going to cost 5 times as much. And that's still the end of the German model.
But equally, that will also impact on our ability to get gas as well, because we'll all be trying to buy the same amount of gas and the prices will go up. So there will be knock-on effects outside of Germany as well.
Absolutely. Just keep in mind, you have a navy and they do not. That matters.
So what's the answer here then, Peter? Is there no answer? Is this just, are you a doom and gloom merchant par excellence? Is there any solution to it in any of this?
Well, I've been accused of being a purveyor of doom porn, so it's hard for me to really argue with that. But every country is going to have to come up with their own solution. Every country basically has 3 paths to choose from. Number 1, you kind of glom on to a country where this isn't a big deal. So in the case of Mexico, you obviously partner with the United States. The Japanese, for example, have decided that that's the way to go. And they cut a deal with both Donald Trump and Joe Biden. The Japanese are the only country to pull that off so far, and they are now part of the inner circle of the American strategic network. Second, you can find a way to go it alone. Maybe you don't need the allies. Maybe what you need is close and you can do kind of a neo-imperial system. I can see the French doing this. I can see the Turks doing this. Option 3 is you just figure out how to go without. And that means a starkly lower standard of living and probably significant changes, not just to your economic system, but your political system. Britain undoubtedly is going to go for some combination of 1 and 2. If Britain had figured out how to handle Brexit by this point, they could now be having the conversation about what's next, but we are still honestly back at square 2 on the Brexit talks.
Yeah. I mean, there's no way of embracing a rolling back of technology, that we don't need smartphones in the way that we have them now. We don't need this level of connectivity, because actually it's ruining our lives, it's compromising our mental health, and this could be a good thing shrouded in a bad thing.
Well, I think you and I are in broad agreement on that from a personal point of view. But I think if we're being honest with ourselves, the economic explosions that some of these technologies have generated is robust. And if you were to suddenly do without the technological revolution, the world writ large, or the countries where that was the decision, or the decision being forced upon them, would be in a significantly worse position in a number of economic sectors. Now, remember, while this can be really annoying in many ways, it does allow some productivity gains that are quite impressive. And if you do without that, that's fine, you can, but you're looking at starkly lower economic growth and probably at a minimum a mild depression as we adjust. And for a lot of the world, that is going to be their future. Something that we think of as ubiquitous now, semiconductors, are actually the process of a relatively complicated manufacturing system that require inputs from half a world away. There is not a country on the planet with a fab facility that has the materials necessary to produce everything locally. Now, the United States does better than most because the US broadly has access to the Western Hemisphere, but even we have some serious holes in that supply chain. So I can see a lot of semiconductors just going away for a while until this all shakes out. And from the point that a finished fab facility starts production to you getting the first intermediate products that can then be folded into other things, that's typically a year. So, what do you want to go analog? Is that your car? Is that passenger jets? Is that your personal communications? Is that your home appliances? I mean, we're going to have to make these decisions.
Yeah, this is fascinating stuff, Peter. Thank you so much. We could talk for hours and hours about this, because almost everything you say has 1,000 other implications that'd be worth exploring, but we won't have time to do that. It's a fascinating book, and it's great to speak to you. Thank you for joining us today.
No problem. Try to stay cool over there.